Hi everyone, it's Will. Now, if you're watching this after receiving advice from your parents and you weren't thrilled to be receiving it, or you're a parent that doesn't seem to understand why your good advice isn't landing with your kids, this video is to help clear that up. Now, by the end of this video, you'll have a clear understanding of why guidance from someone who's a few steps ahead can sometimes be easier to receive, and then also understanding when a parent's perspective can be especially valuable and how both can better support decisions in your 20s. Now, before we go further, a quick note: as someone who is 25 years old, I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of people in this stage of life is trying to navigate everything alone. And having people around you who push you to stay consistent, to think bigger, and to continue growing can make a huge difference, especially during periods of uncertainty or transition. And that's a big reason why communities like our mentorship school community can be so valuable. So if you're looking for more accountability, more support in a group focused on career growth, relationships, and personal development, you can check out the link in my bio, and I also mentioned it in my description below. Now back to the topic. If you're in your 20s and you're early in your career, some of these feelings, they might be familiar to you. Now, one reason that advice from our parents can sometimes be difficult to receive is the emotional history behind it. Because we spent our childhood being guided by our parents. And if we move home after college or we begin trying to establish ourselves as adults, receiving direction from those same people, it can sometimes make us feel like we're being treated as children again, even if it's not our parents' intention. Another reason is that parents and young adults have entered adulthood under different circumstances. And there's plenty of advice that I've received from my dad that's still relevant today and valuable. But at the same time, the career landscape has changed significantly, and the wisdom may still apply, but the way it's applied might need to look different. And then also ownership matters, because if a plan is consistently created for us from our parents, we may be less committed to following through because we do not fully see it as our decision. For example, your parents might encourage you to attend this retreat because they genuinely believe that it will help you. And that support can be incredibly valuable. But if you never personally choose to attend or identified what you wanted to gain from it, you may not approach the experience with the same level of investment as if you were the one who decided that you wanted to go on that retreat. So I think our 20s are a time that's exciting because we have the opportunity to develop our own identity. And sometimes receiving advice from our parents isn't as helpful because it might be keeping us from developing that individual identity. Now, let's look at why hearing from someone a few steps ahead of us can be incredibly valuable. So unlike hearing from our parents, someone who might be 25 when you're 22 talking to you about a particular industry, their insights can feel very relatable because chances are the industry hasn't changed as much in the last 3 years. And of course, someone in their 50s or their 60s who might be your parents' age might still be in the same industry that you are currently looking at, but their experience of being in the industry in their 20s is far removed. And sometimes when you're 22, talking to someone who is 25 can make the next step feel more attainable. Through no fault of your parents, it can be intimidating for a recent graduate to hear from someone with 3 more decades of experience because reaching that level can feel much further away. When they hear from someone just a few years older, they may start to think, oh, I could get there in a few years. And I also think, building off of what I said earlier, there's less emotional history than there is when you're talking with a parent, because someone outside of the family who's just a few steps ahead can offer guidance without bringing family dynamics into the conversation. The recent graduate is less likely to feel as though they're being parented or receiving the same kinds of instructions they heard growing up. Also, being able to receive advice from someone who is still navigating the uncertainty but can offer guidance helps a recent grad recognize that you do not need to have all the answers to be supportive to other people. And I think every stage of life does come with uncertainty. I don't think that's just unique to Gen Z, but hearing from someone who is still figuring out parts of their career can make their advice feel even more relatable and helpful. But there are also so many times when receiving advice from a parent can be incredibly helpful. So we're going to take a closer look at when it might make sense, because there's a lot of those times, to turn to a parent, and when it might be more helpful to hear from someone a few steps ahead of you is what we just referenced. So as a son, the first thing I would want to hear from my parents is them asking me if I'm open to receiving their advice. There's something about a person asking for permission that makes me more likely to be open to it. They're no longer springing this onto me. They are giving me agency in this decision where I could either accept their advice or I don't need to listen to it. And then there's other times where receiving parents' advice can be incredibly valuable is, when you need their emotional support. You need emotional support from someone who knows you very deeply. In this case, hearing from your parent can be more effective than a 20-something that's not involved in the family dynamic or knows you that well. Because I think there is something special about having a person that's known you your entire life and being able to give you advice on something that's been on your mind. Another time where looking for a parent's advice can be especially valuable is when having more decades of experience is beneficial. You might be asking a question about life in your 40s or your 50s, planning for the future, curious about certain realities of life. These are all things that hearing from someone who has more life experience than a 25-year-old could be helpful. Also for me, if I'm receiving advice from a parent that is delivered in a way that recognizes me as an adult and the language around the advice reflects that, and it isn't too similar to how I was told to do something when I was 10 years old, it resonates more with me and might be the same for you. Now, there also might be advice that you're seeking in a particular area that hasn't changed drastically over the last few decades. And because of that, seeking advice from your parents can be helpful too. And also for times where they have direct experience with the specific piece of advice that you're looking for can be helpful. And then there's just a few of the many ways. These are just a few of the many ways that can be valuable to seek advice from a parent. And you might have your own answers to this question too. These are just a few that I've seen for myself. But our parents can be a tremendous source of support. And as we wrap up today's conversation, we are seeing that learning from someone who's a few steps ahead of us can be incredibly valuable, and see why sometimes good advice from parents might not land as well. But we can also see how much of a help our parents can be for us, and to look at some of the situations where it calls for receiving our parents' advice. And you have the opportunity to answer that question for yourself. So as we move forward, whether you are a young adult or a parent, hopefully this episode shed light on why you might want to seek advice from someone a few steps ahead of you, or what are the situations where you might seek advice from your parents. But also as a parent, understanding why your kid might not be taking the good advice that you're giving them and better understand the roots underneath that. Because I think there's so much value in both perspectives as we navigate these exciting and uncertain times. So as mentioned earlier, your 20s, they can feel exciting, confusing, overwhelming, and uncertain all at the same time. And trying to navigate everything alone can make it feel even harder. So if you're looking for more accountability, more support, and a group of people focused on growing in areas like career, relationships, and personal development, check out the mentorship school community built around the Kindling program in my bio as well as in the description below. But thanks again, everyone, and I will see you next time.